When you think of cartoons, a few different channels probably come to mind, but one in particular kind of stands out for many: Cartoon Network. The channel's had many ups and downs, but somehow in the late 2000s, one show brought the channel back from what many considered to be the brink. It's easy to forget the weirdness that was the mid-2000s and the controversial choice that was CN Real. The year was 2009. Cartoon Network, despite its name, was only airing 4 new original cartoon series. Though all of these series would have short lifespans, one of them would kick off a renaissance of sorts on the channel that would impact animation as a whole. This is the story of how the marvelous misadventures of Flapjack accidentally saved animation. But before we get into that, let's do a short overview of Cartoon Network, its history, and what exactly led to that point. In 1986, Ted Turner, super rich media magnate, running hot off the success of CNN, purchased MGM Studios in a $1.5 billion buyout. You know, MGM, that giant movie studio? Yeah, the one with the lion. And just 74 days later, Ted Turner was forced to sell MGM back to its previous owner with one stipulation: he was able to keep a huge portion of the MGM cartoon backlog. Though, at the moment, Ted Turner had nothing to do with his newly acquired library of cartoons, at least not yet. A few years later in 1991, Ted would once again make another huge purchase in the world of cartoons, another relatively minor studio, Hanna-Barbera. You might have heard of them. They were behind a couple minor shows you might have seen once or twice. With this purchase, Ted Turner basically owned every popular American-made cartoon, but he still had nowhere for these to air. Even Nickelodeon at this point was really just beginning to produce and air original cartoons with shows like Doug, Rugrats, and Ren and Stimpy. So a few years later, on October 1st, 1992, Cartoon Network would officially launch. The channel was the first 24-hour channel that ran only cartoons, similar to Ted Turner's idea for CNN being 24-hour news. This gamble paid off, and between the channel's backlog of cartoons and deals done with cable bundles, Cartoon Network became the 5th most popular cable channel in the US in 1994. The channel was doing fantastic, but was still missing something important: original programming. So in 1994, with some former Nickelodeon producers on board, Cartoon Network launched What a Cartoon, which resulted in some of the most important cartoons to ever air. The program resulted in several shows, including Dexter's Laboratory, Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, and the Powerpuff Girls. These shows wouldn't just cement Cartoon Network's staying power, but would influence just about every animator to this day. Things were going about as well as they could be, and the next few years would add more and more shows to their roster. Shows like Courage the Cowardly Dog, Ed, Edd and Eddy, Kids Next Door. You like anime? Check out Toonami. Let's sprinkle a little Samurai Jack on there. What About a Foster's Home? And a metric ton of others. Things were looking up for the channel, but soon everything would come crashing down. In the late 2000s, many of the channel's flagship shows were ending. The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy in 2008, Ed, Edd and Eddy in 2009, and Foster's also in 2009. This was under Stuart Snyder's run as president of Cartoon Network. In those shows' place, it was decided to bring in something else that children would love: Andrew WK. This was known as CN Real, and for the first time on the channel, several live-action shows would air. It's hard to find exact numbers in terms of viewer ratings, but Unapologetic Nerd took a bunch of IMDb numbers and put them on this fancy graph, and right around here, we can see a definitive freefall in average show ratings on the channel. In fact, during this time, there were only a small handful of animated shows actually being created. Though most of these would just be fleeting shows in the grand scheme of the channel, one of the shows, despite only running for a relatively short time, would actually kick off a renaissance. But how did this happen? Ever since he was a child, the creator of the marvelous misadventures of Flapjack, Mark Throp Van Orman, wow, that's a badass name, loved the idea of adventuring. He would be Captain Flapjack, and he dreamt of traveling the world on a flying motorcycle. Unfortunately for him, flying motorcycles don't exist, but fortunately for us, this dream was the early groundwork for what would eventually become his show. His journey into Cartoon Network would begin with him taking an unpaid internship and working as a storyboard artist for several shows, including both the Powerpuff Girls and the Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy. Van Orman spent several years making a name for himself before finally being successful in his pitch of Flapjack. And finally, in 2008, the show would debut, right as a bunch of the classics were coming to an end and a CN Reel was revving up production. The show was very much in the vein of many older shows, such as Courage the Cowardly Dog and even SpongeBob. The animation was verging on grotesque more often than not, and the gleeful humor typically had undertones of a much darker show. Because of this, the fan reviews were kind of polarizing, typically coming in around a 5 or so out of 10 on average. But that didn't stop from getting some pretty solid critic reviews, even winning an Emmy at one point. which is something that most pieces of media can't really say. And then, just as quickly as the show came into being, it was gone. So how did a show that ran for 3 seasons, was only on the air for 2 years, and was met with a generally middling response change the course of Cartoon Network? Well, out of the ashes rose. Adventure Time is arguably one of the most important cartoons of the last decade. It was one of the first shows to come out of the CN Real time period on the channel, and it ushered in a new era of animation, not just on the channel, but kind of as a whole. And although Pendleton Ward's original short film for Adventure Time went sort of viral in 2007, it wouldn't be picked up by Cartoon Network for some time. So Pendleton Ward worked as a storyboard artist and writer on Flapjack, waiting for the right moment for his show to debut. But Pendleton Ward wasn't the only Flapjack alumni to go on to create a massively influential cartoon. J.G. Quintel worked as a creative director as well as a storyboard artist for the show before going on to create regular show. These 2 shows together would be Cartoon Network's flagships for the next several years and would really lead the channel into what's commonly referred to as the channel's renaissance. This was a huge return to form for the channel, but what about elsewhere in the industry? Well, Disney was in kind of a similar situation where most of their mainstay shows were ending, and Nickelodeon decided for the time to just keep their shows going on probably a bit longer than they should have. But out of Flapjack, Disney got its own iconic show from creator Alex Hirsch, Gravity Falls. And then from Adventure Time came several more shows that would help define the Renaissance further. Pat McHale, who actually also worked on Flapjack, went on to create Over the Garden Wall. Rebecca Sugar went on to create Steven Universe. Ian Jones-Quartey went on to create OKKO. And finally, terrible person Skylar Page created Clarence. A huge number of upcoming talent all eventually got their chance to create their art, really because of Flapjack. Flapjack and Chowder, the show was airing alongside for its run, existed in a dark few years in terms of animation. Where many classics were ending and animation wasn't being as invested in as it was previously, Flapjack drew upon its predecessors and paved the way for so many future shows. The show's darker sense of humor allowed later shows to get away with much more than they would or could have, and it gave several of the last decade's most iconic creators a stepping stone to completely revitalize the animation industry. It's insane when you look at just how big of an impact the show actually ended up having. But they definitely weren't setting out to change animation or even save it. It just kind of happened.